In the rolling heart of Illinois, where wild prairie grass once danced with the wind, stands the ghost of a place too dark for history to remember. Sacred Heart Seminary, once hailed as the crown jewel of Catholic education in the Midwest, was not just a school of theology. It was a gateway into something far more sinister. Between 1847 and 1862, 17 young priests and seminarians vanished without a trace from within its ivy-covered walls. For decades, the church insisted they had been transferred or sent on spiritual retreats. But a hidden trove of letters, found buried beneath the chapel floorboards, now tells a far more horrifying truth of abductions, trafficking, and cold-blooded murder. What makes this tale uniquely chilling is not just the mystery, but the masterminds. Evidence now suggests the 3 men who operated Sacred Heart Seminary for 15 years were not clergy at all, but imposters. Irish criminals, murderers, men who had killed the original priests, stolen their identities, and wormed their way into power. Their crimes would remain buried literally and figuratively for over a century, sealed away by a Vatican desperate to protect its reputation. But today, that seal is broken. Before we walk into this abyss, know this. This story isn't for the faint of heart. It's for those willing to uncover the darkness hidden inside institutions we're taught to trust. If you're still reading, you're one of us. Let's go back to 1847 and unearth what the church tried so hard to forget. The United States, in 1847, was undergoing a transformation. Waves of Irish immigrants fleeing famine poured into American cities by the hundreds of thousands. They brought with them Catholicism devout, ancient and foreign to Protestant America. The reaction was vicious. Entire towns erupted into violence at the mere hint of Catholic influence. In Philadelphia, anti-Catholic mobs torched churches and schools, leaving dozens dead and injured. In Massachusetts, a convent was burned to the ground. Nuns fled through the back windows, chased by mobs in such hostile territory. The Catholic Church needed American-born priestsmen who could speak without an accent, navigate local customs, and act as cultural bridges. Sacred Heart Seminary was born from this need. Built in 1845, just 40 miles southwest of Chicago, it stood proudly on 400 acres of untouched prairie land. Its mission, to mold American Catholic leadership from within. The structure itself was an architectural marvel. Designed by the famed Irish architect Patrick Keeley, the main building was 3 stories of brick and stone, its Gothic windows soaring nearly 20 feet high. It had a bell tower whose echo carried for miles, and hand-carved pews imported, all the way from Bavaria. The seminary cost a jaw-dropping $40,000 more than entire towns were worth at the time. Funded by wealthy Catholic families from Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis, Sacred Heart was seen as the vanguard of Catholic survival in America. Among its early benefactors were Patrick Murphy, a shipping magnate, Francis O'Brien, a brewing tycoon, and Margaret Connolly, a powerful widow whose $8,000 donation alone was enough to fund an entire wing. The library boasted over 3,000 volumes, a collection that rivaled any university west of the Mississippi. Unusual for rural America, the building had gas lighting, indoor plumbing, and a state-of-the-art heating system, all signs of its importance. At the head of this magnificent institution stood Father Superior Edmund Walsh, who arrived from County Cork in 1846, towering at nearly 6'4", with a flowing silver beard and piercing gray eyes. He exuded charisma and control. He spoke with the refined accent of a Trinity College man and claimed honors in moral theology and canon law from Ireland's elite seminaries. His letters of recommendation were glowing, signed, allegedly, by bishops and archbishops. He was flanked by 2 equally impressive figures, Rector Thomas Murphy and Dean Patrick O'Brien. Murphy, stoic and scholarly, claimed degrees in philosophy and canon law from Belgium's University of Louvain. He said he had once been the secretary to the Bishop of Cork. Dean O'Brien, the youngest of the trio, claimed expertise in classical languages and theology. His gift for rhetoric could move audiences to tears. Together, they looked every bit the holy trinity of intellect, piety, and discipline. Their first class in the fall of 1847 consisted of 12 hand-picked young men from Catholic families across the Midwest. They came from Irish, German, and French background, sons of immigrants and working class, families who had given everything for their sons to wear the collar of God. There was Michael Brennan, a brilliant theological mind from Chicago. Hinrich, Weber and Johann Uber, German boys from Milwaukee. Antoine Duboul, from a French fur-trading family in Detroit. And even Thomas Morrison and David Anderson, converts from Protestant families. These boys had been chosen carefully, not just for their faith or potential, but for their wealth, strength, and social vulnerability. Unbeknownst to them, they were walking into a trap designed not to educate, but to evaluate and sell. From the outside, life at Sacred Heart appeared typical of any seminary. Students rose at 4:30 a.m. for prayer, attended Mass at dawn, then spent their days immersed in study and physical labor. Latin, Greek, philosophy, canon law, theology, sermon writing every day was regimented to the minute. Manual labor on the grounds was framed as spiritual purification, but beneath that routine was a darker agenda. Students weren't allowed to leave the grounds without permission. Mail was censored. Family contact was limited to 1 letter per month. Even during supervised visits to the nearby town of Millfield, students were forbidden to speak of seminary life. What the students didn't realize was that this isolation was no accident. It was designed to keep them disconnected from the outside world, from their families, and from each other. Surveillance wasn't spiritual, it was strategic. The 3 false priests had built a closed ecosystem where suspicion, fear, and silence could thrive unchecked. Then, in February 1848, just 5 months after the seminary opened, the disappearances began. The first to vanish was Michael Brennan. It was the dead of winter February 1848, and Illinois was buried beneath one of the most brutal blizzards in its history. For 3 days, snow howled across the prairie, rising in drifts that swallowed entire doorways and pressed against second-story windows. Travel was impossible, and that was precisely the point. Michael was a standout among the seminary's first cohort. At 22, he'd already impressed Father Walsh with his grasp of moral theology and his fluent Latin. His father ran 3 successful grocery stores in Chicago's Irish Quarter, and the family had poured years of savings into the $200 annual tuition, believing they were investing in both their son's salvation and their own legacy in the community. Michael, full of gratitude, had written home days earlier, gushing about being selected for special administrative duties, access to financial records, letters, and internal reports. It was an honor he saw as a sacred responsibility that would be the last letter his family ever received from him. On the evening of February 13th, Michael was called to Father Walsh's private office, an isolated room in the seminary's far wing. Several students saw him walk down the long hallway, leather portfolio in hand, just after dinner. It was 8:30 p.m. The snow outside was relentless. By 9 o'clock, raised voices echoed through the stone walls, too muffled for words to be clear, but unmistakably tense. The arguing went on for nearly an hour before silence fell. Michael never returned to his dormitory. His roommate, Joseph Kennedy, waited up through the night, assuming Michael had been given special permission to sleep elsewhere. But by morning prayers, there was still no sign of him. Then, during breakfast, Father Walsh delivered the official announcement. Michael, he said, had been called away in the night. A remote Irish Catholic settlement near the Iowa border had been hit with a devastating cholera outbreak. Their priest had succumbed, leaving the faithful spiritually abandoned in their hour of need. Despite his youth, Michael had volunteered to minister to the dying, a heroic act. Walsh declared, of true priestly courage. The students were stunned. The story seemed plausible. Cholera had ravaged communities in recent years, and priests were often among the only educated men brave enough to enter infected towns. Michael's sudden departure fit the narrative of sacrifice. Except to Joseph, he knew something was wrong. Michael hadn't taken his winter coat, boots, or gloves, all of which remained hanging neatly in the shared wardrobe. No one travels across snow-choked Illinois in February without them. And most telling of all, his grandmother's silver rosary lay untouched on his pillow. Michael had never been seen without it, not during Mass, not in class, not even during sleep. To leave without it? Unthinkable. When Joseph quietly approached Father Walsh with these concerns the next day, the reaction was swift and shocking. Walsh accused him of spiritual arrogance, of daring to question church authority. He spoke of the dangers of pride and whispered rebellion. As punishment, Joseph was sentenced to a week of solitary penance in the seminary's basement chapel. But this wasn't just any chapel. It was carved directly into the hillside. Beneath the seminary, a damp stone chamber used for punishment and reflection. Windowless, candlelit, and frigid, it was more crypt than sanctuary. And it was here, beneath layers of frozen earth and solemn prayer, that Joseph would encounter the shadows of something much darker. The first night, around 2 a.m., he heard the hooves and wheels crunching against the frozen soil above. The sounds were clear, almost too clear, given how deep underground he was. A wagon, moving slowly, carefully, followed by muffled voices, 3 of them. Familiar voices: Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien. The noises would continue in the same pattern. Each night, horses arriving from the main road, voices in hushed tones, the creaking of wagon springs, the sound of someone being dragged, loaded, heaved into place. And then the wagon would roll away, heading south toward Springfield, not Chicago. On the third night, Joseph dared to peek through the dirt-streaked glass of the basement's only slit window. The lanterns above flickered just enough to illuminate 3 men lifting a large bundle wrapped in heavy cloth into the back of the wagon. It took all 3 of them. The weight, the care with which they moved. It was not supplies. It was not food. It was a body. 6 weeks later, it happened. Again. This time, the victim was Thomas Gallar, a 20-year-old seminarian from Milwaukee, beloved by everyone. Gentle, devout, and deeply dedicated, Thomas came from a family that had sacrificed everything to send him to Sacred Heart. His father, once a brewery worker, now labored extra shifts. His mother took in laundry, sewing, anything to raise money. They had even sold their farmland, moving into a cramped apartment to save on rent. Every dollar went toward Thomas's calling. He bore the weight of that sacrifice like a badge of honor. On the night of March 30th, Thomas was approached by Dean O'Brien in the chapel after evening prayer. O'Brien whispered something grave, urgent. Matters, academic concerns. Thomas looked confused, but he obeyed. He always obeyed. By 9 p.m., sounds echoed again from Father Walsh's office. Arguing, distress, furniture moving, raised voices. Been silenced. At 11 p.m., the wagon creaked into motion once more, wheels muffled in the snow. The next morning, a solemn Walsh addressed the students. Thomas, he explained, had suffered a spiritual breakdown, troubled by impure thoughts too. Heavy for priestly life, he had chosen to leave and retreat to a contemplative monastery in the Wisconsin wilderness. There, in silence and solitude, he hoped to find redemption. Another perfectly shaped narrative. And once again, The details fell apart under even the slightest scrutiny. Thomas had left behind his most cherished item, a hand-carved rosary from his dying mother, not forgotten in haste, left deliberately on his desk, as if staged. His cash envelope, holding $50 for expenses, remained untouched in Father Walsh's safe. Most alarming of all, an unfinished letter to his sister lay on his desk. The sentence broke mid-thought. "I wake each morning grateful to God for guiding me to this holy place." No farewell, no goodbye, Dot, and so the whispers began. Among the students, trust eroded. Whispers in the dark dormitories. Inventory of who remained, and what might make them the next target. Had they spoken out too much? Were they too clever? Too connected? But always it began with a private summons. By the spring of 1848, Sacred Heart Seminary no longer felt like a school. It felt like a trap. 7 students remained. 5 had vanished. Each disappearance followed a familiar pattern private summons, raised voices in Walsh's office, eerie silence that followed, and then the next morning, a polished explanation delivered from the pulpit. But the stories, as convincing as they sounded on the surface, didn't hold up under the weight of details. Antoine Dubois was the third to vanish. The son of a wealthy French fur trader from Detroit, Antoine was known for his quiet intellect and uncanny wilderness skills. He could track animals, speak Ojibwe, and read the stars like maps. Walsh claimed that Antoine had been sent to a threatened French mission deep in the Michigan wilderness, where native hostility had left the parish. Priest isolated and vulnerable, but Antoine hadn't packed. His hunting knife, gifted by his grandfather, remained on his nightstand. His fur-lined cloak, essential for travel in spring's unpredictable chill, was left behind. Most damning, the letter to his brother, half-written and joyful, spoke of his excitement to finally study Hebrew scripture. He had never mentioned any missionary calling. No goodbyes. No warnings. Just another empty bed. Then came Hinrich Weber. Hinrich was Thomas Gallagher's closest friend, his quiet shadow. After Thomas disappeared, Hinrich became consumed by curiosity. He asked questions, not openly, but carefully. A word here, a glance there. He compared notes with Joseph Kennedy and noticed something disturbing. Every student who vanished came from a family with money, skills, or connections. Every one of them had been called to Father Walsh's office under the guise of privilege or discipline. Then one morning, Hinrich was gone. Father Walsh announced that he had been transferred, without notice or goodbye, to a specialized seminary. In Baltimore, one focused on preparing clergy for German-speaking communities. The transfer, Walsh said, had to happen swiftly and discreetly, for the sake of his spiritual integrity. No one had ever heard of such a rule. His things were gone. The room had been stripped bare. And just like that, Hinrich Weber became a ghost in the seminary halls. Joseph Kennedy, still haunted by the nighttime wagon sounds from the basement, now knew these weren't isolated events. There was a system, deliberate, calculated, and growing bolder. By the end of that first year, the class of 12 had shrunk to 7, and the fear was suffocating. Students no longer asked questions aloud. The warmth that had defined their early days, the shared jokes, the theological debates, the brotherhood had been replaced by paranoia. Eyes darted across the chapel. Doors were bolted from the inside. Every private meeting with the priests was now a source of dread. And the priests? They changed too. Father Walsh, once humble and reserved, began dressing in rich silk vestments. He now wore a Swiss gold pocket watch and sat behind a newly imported mahogany desk. Murphy, who had once lectured with simple chalk and dog-eared texts, suddenly had rare leather-bound tomes, delivered monthly books that cost more than a family's monthly income. Dean O'Brien, always sharp in speech, now rode a magnificent Black Stallion, he claimed, was a gift from Irish patrons. His writing style and air of aristocracy betrayed something different, something less priestly, more predatory. And then there was the lay brother, Francis McManus. He had arrived quietly. With the three priests, he didn't teach, he didn't preach. He was their shadow, their errand boy. Thin, nervous, and always watching, he skulked about the seminary like a servant who knew too much. When students tried to talk to him, he'd shrink away. But everyone noticed he always knew where everyone was, what buildings were unlocked, which sheds had been disturbed, and he hated being asked about the missing students. Anytime their names came up, he'd vanish. Just like them, outside the seminary, the nearby town of Millfield began to whisper. Farmers noticed strange things. Covered wagons traveling slowly through the fields at night. Lanterns moving across the hills. Samuel Morrison, who owned land adjacent to Sacred Heart, discovered items scattered along his fence. A prayer book with Michael Brennan's name, spectacles belonging to Hinrich, and a silver crucifix everyone remembered hanging around Thomas's neck. When Morrison brought them to the priests, Walsh's explanation was chillingly calm. They are shedding earthly attachments, part of the path to sainthood. But Morrison didn't believe it, and neither did Joseph. While others lived in silence, Joseph began to observe, to record. He made lists. Who had disappeared, what they left behind, what nights the wagons moved. He noticed the weather always played a role cold, stormy, moonless. Perfect conditions for hiding tracks and muffling screams. Most of all, he noticed the timing. Disappearances always happened midweek, never on weekends, when church officials might visit. Always after a consultation with Father Walsh that stretched long into the night. And always followed by silence. Then came James O'Malley. Was different, older than most. Educated, confident, and connected. His father was a wealthy merchant in Detroit, and his uncle was a high-ranking church official. James had a classical education trained in logic, investigation, and Latin rhetoric. He smelled deception like a bloodhound, and he began to dig Dot. First, he did what Joseph had done: watch, listen, record. But James went further. He accessed records, examined financial ledgers, counted the seminary's income, and realized the math didn't add up. Tuition alone couldn't cover the new furniture, books, horses, and luxuries the priests had accumulated. There was more money coming in. A lot more. James began looking for letters, hiding places, anything that might explain the truth. He found it beneath the floorboard in the library. A cache of letters. Hundreds of them, written in careful code, masked with religious phrases, but unmistakably commercial. They spoke of deliveries, specimens, physical condition, and premium prices. One letter, dated November 1849, read, 2 prime specimens, German and Irish, delivered without resistance. Buyers in Wisconsin and Indiana pleased. Literacy increases value. Expect next shipment before thaw. That was all James needed to confirm what he already feared. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't spiritual crisis. This was trafficking. James O'Malley hadn't come to Sacred Heart to play detective. But by the winter of 1849, he had no choice. The seminary that was supposed to train him for the priesthood had become a labyrinth of whispers, fear, and buried lies. After 5 disappearances, in less than a year, and more polished excuses from the 3 priests who ruled the institution, like monarchs, James knew something was fundamentally wrong. Where others kept silent, James chose to act. His advantage? Connections. His uncle, Father Patrick O'Malley, was secretary to the Bishop of Detroit, a man with real reach across church networks. And unlike the other students, most of whom came from humble or immigrant families, James's father was a wealthy merchant. with political clout in Michigan and beyond. If James went missing, the church wouldn't just send a prayer. It would send an investigation that made him dangerous. And he knew it. In secret, James created a timeline of disappearances. He tracked weather patterns, seminary events, and the priests' movements. He noticed a disturbing trend. The vanished students were not only wealthy, educated, and skilled, but also socially isolated. Many had no close local family. Some were converts. Few had outside all eyes. James also noticed that the seminary's expenses were wildly out of proportion with its official income. Despite charging steep tuition, the math didn't add up. Father Murphy's endless flow of rare theological volumes, Dean O'Brien's extravagant stallion, Father Walsh's imported furniture, and gold-ringed spectacles. Someone was funding them, and it wasn't God. Then came the break. One frigid morning, James crept into the seminary library while most students were in prayer. He had noticed a section of warped floorboards near the shelves on theological law. Something about them seemed off, unaligned. The nails, he discovered, had been loosened. With delicate fingers and a pocket blade, James lifted a plank. What he found beneath, it chilled him more than the cold stone floors ever could. Letters, dozens of them. Old, stained, written in multiple hands, some elegant, others crude. Most were cloaked in religious language. But it didn't take a trained mind to decipher their code. The words deliverance, offerings, and communicants were all euphemisms. The real messages were clear. Received boy from Milwaukee. Strong, literate, suitable for lumber accounting. Buyer in La Crosse will pay full sum. Next specimen must be younger. Previous had resistance. Ensure silence before shipment. German lad exceptional. Premium paid. More of this type desired. James read in horror. They weren't just taking the students. They were selling them. Human trafficking. Carefully orchestrated. Hidden beneath robes and incense. A commercial enterprise disguised as divine vocation. Even worse. Some letters referenced ... failures. 2 had to be disposed of. Spiritual resistance too strong. Buried per standard. Standard? How many students had been disposed of? Were there graves beneath their feet? Was this seminary built on a mass graveyard? James copied the worst of the letters by hand, hiding them in the lining of his robe. He dared not remove the originals. The priests checked everything. But he knew this evidence alone could bring the entire operation crashing down. If only he could get it out. But escape wasn't easy. The priests had anticipated suspicion. All outgoing mail was reviewed. All student correspondence was filtered through Father Walsh's office. When James tried to write a coded Latin message to his uncle, the letter came back open. A warning note was attached. All ecclesiastical writing must pass through theological screening. Refrain from cryptic indulgences. F.R. Walsh, James. Knew he was being watched. McManus, a skittish lay brother, had begun shadowing him. Sweeping floors where James walked. Replacing candles in rooms James visited. Pretending to repair doors that weren't broken. And always taking notes in his little black book. Then James found his dormitory searched. His paper shifted. His ink bottle moved a 1/4 inch left. His robe slightly damp, as if someone had worn it. The message was clear. You are being hunted. The priests now saw him not as a student, but as a threat. That's when Father Walsh summoned him. It was a quiet evening. The sky outside deep purple with approaching snow. James entered the office calmly, but he knew it might be a one-way visit. The room had changed. Where once had been simple decor, now hung oil paintings in gilded frames. The air smelled of imported pipe tobacco. Gold-leafed books lined the walls, and waiting inside, Walsh, O'Brien, and Murphy. No robes. No holy smiles. Just three men in expensive coats and hard eyes. Walsh dropped the act first. "So," he said in a voice stripped of any clerical gentleness, "you've been reading things that don't belong to you." He leaned back, hands steepled, eyes cold. "You've been busy." James said nothing. Walsh smirked. "You think because you're connected, you're untouchable? Detroit won't save you out here. Not when the snow's this deep. Not when nobody can hear you scream." Then came the offer. "You're smart, boy. Smarter than the rest. You help us. Use those family ties to bring in more boys like you. Obedient, educated, alone. In return, you graduate. You preach. You rise. The second option? Disappear." Like the rest. James didn't respond. Not yet. He simply nodded slowly. "Let me think on it," he said. Walsh grinned. "Do." But James had no intention of joining them. He had only one goal now: expose them. All of them. And he knew that time was running out. In the weeks following his chilling meeting with Father Walsh, James O'Malley walked a razor's edge. He had refused both options: to cooperate with the traffickers, or to vanish like the others. But he knew the refusal could only be temporary in their eyes. The three men no longer masquerading as priests, but now openly operating as predators cloaked in ritual, understood that James was dangerous. And James understood one thing in return: he had to escape, but not alone. He had to bring the truth with him. The seminary, once majestic in its silence, now felt like a fortress. McManus followed him constantly, shadowing his every step. The other students, reduced to 6, were too frightened to act. They slept with their boots on, their rosaries clutched in hand, and their words barely above whispers. But James had an idea. During one of the priests' weekly private devotion nights, those eerie Saturdays when students were locked in, their dorms and forbidden from leaving, he faked a stomach illness and secured permission to rest in the infirmary instead. The room was near the basement level, and it gave him access to a stairwell the others couldn't see. That night, he slipped down the stairs past the chapel, where Joseph Kennedy had once heard wagon wheels grinding through the snow, and into the lower chambers of the seminary. What he found beneath the earth would stay with him for life. The basement levels were larger than anyone imagined. Tunnels stretched into the hillside, rooms carved into the stone like crypts. Some were filled with crates, others with ropes, tarps, and tools. But one chamber behind a bolted wooden door was different. James pried it open with a rusted nettle rod. Inside, by the glow of his candle, lay the heart of the operation. Ledgers, maps, letters, transaction records, going back over a decade. Each page confirmed what James had feared. Sacred Heart was not the beginning. It was just one branch of a larger trafficking network. The seminary served as a collection site. Young men, selected for wealth, education, obedience, and isolation, were groomed and sold to mining camps, lumber mills, and industrial barons across 5 states. The documents listed names: Michael Brennan, Thomas Gallagher, Henrik Weber, all priced, all sold. Some entries had notations: obedient, literacy adds value, used for supervision, shipped to Indiana, no complications. But others were darker: resisted, damaged, disposed. And beneath that word disposed, James found a list: 17 names. 17 young men buried on seminary grounds, some because they resisted, others because they knew too much. Their graves were unmarked, their deaths unrecorded. James copied as much as he could: names, buyer locations, code phrases, ledger page numbers. Then he slipped back into the dormitory before dawn, heart pounding, hands trembling, pages hidden in the lining of his mattress. But he knew he couldn't wait much longer. He needed help from outside. That help came in the form of a Rumor. In March 1850, word quietly spread through the clergy network. A Vatican emissary had arrived in the American Midwest. His name was Bishop Giovanni Montini, dispatched directly from Rome to conduct unannounced inspections of Catholic institutions. The Church, troubled by rising whispers of corruption and irregularities in far-flung seminaries, had sent him to investigate without fanfare. Montini was no ordinary bureaucrat. A former canon law professor in Rome, he was known for exposing corruption in France, rooting out abuse in German monasteries, and dismantling entire dioceses in Italy when they failed moral scrutiny. And now he was nearby. In Illinois. James knew it was his only chance. He learned through a coded bulletin that Bishop Montini was temporarily residing at the home of Bishop William Corder in Chicago. Sacred Heart was only a few hours away if he knew how to reach him. So James crafted a letter. It looked like a spiritual inquiry. Written in Latin, it used phrases known only to trained theologians, phrases that subtly indicated grave ecclesiastical misconduct. He requested a private meeting to clarify teachings on church authority in the face of doctrinal violations. For anyone else, the letter would sound like a harmless question about church politics. For someone like Montini, it would scream, corruption, here, now, but how to send it? He couldn't use seminary mail. McManus read everything. The priest screened every envelope. He needed a third party. And so, once again, James turned to Samuel Morrison, the skeptical farmer whose land bordered Sacred Heart, the same man who had once found a crucifix in his field on a cold afternoon. During his ground maintenance duty, James slipped through a broken fence near the west edge of the property. There, he waited near Morrison's wood shed. When the farmer approached, James didn't speak. He simply handed him a sealed envelope and a handful of coins. "I think you know something's wrong," James whispered. "This proves it." Morrison took the letter without a word. James returned to the seminary before the evening bell. 1 week later, a messenger arrived. A quiet man with a Vatican seal. James was summoned. But not by Walsh. By Montini. March 15, 1850. A date that would echo through the walls of Sacred Heart Seminary and in the Vatican archives for centuries. The meeting was held at St. Patrick's Church in Millfield, a small wooden chapel less than a mile from the seminary's border. On the surface, it was a routine pastoral visit, nothing unusual. But for James O'Malley, it was his first and only chance to reveal the darkness festering beneath Sacred Heart's pious surface. Inside the sacristy, Bishop Giovanni Montini waited. He was a small man with sharp eyes, dressed in simple clerical black, a gold crucifix hanging from his neck. But the room felt like a courtroom, and James, nervous yet determined, entered as both witness and prosecutor. They spoke in Latin, not out of formality, but for secrecy. James laid it all out. He produced handwritten copies of the coded letters, summarized the ledger entries, described the pattern of disappearances, the timing, the weather, the falsified stories. He recited names: Michael Brennan, Thomas Gallagher, Antoine Dubois. He detailed how the students were selected based on family wealth, obedience, and social isolation. He showed Montini the copied records of transactions, victims described as merchandise sold to buyers across 5 states. He explained the basement tunnels, the hidden chambers, the coded correspondence. Most chilling of all, he listed the 17 names marked as permanently disposed. Montini said little, but his face paled with every revelation. Then came the question that sealed it. "Do you have any proof of their identities?" James nodded. "Not of who they claim to be, but I know who they're not." He handed over 3 documents: a forged letter of ordination, a faked seminary transcript, and a copied excerpt from one of the coded letters written in crude Irish English Signed, by Sem. Montini stood up, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. "You've done enough," he said in English. "Now let me do the rest." Within 48 hours, the Vatican responded. Encrypted telegraphs raced across the Atlantic, requesting background verification on Father Edmund Walsh, Rector Thomas Murphy, and Dean Patrick O'Brien. Replies came swiftly. No such priests had ever been sent from Ireland to Sacred Heart Seminary. Worse, those names had appeared on the passenger list of the Bridge's Hope, a merchant ship that had departed Dublin in 1846, but never arrived intact. It had been attacked off the coast of Newfoundland by pirates. The bodies of 3 priests were never recovered. Now it was clear. The men running Sacred Heart had murdered the real clergy, stolen their credentials, and assumed their identities. And they'd done it brilliantly. They'd fooled bishops. They'd navigated church politics. And they had operated without question for nearly 4 years. Until now, Bishop Montini wasted no time. He summoned the U.S. Marshals, bypassing local authorities who could be compromised. A coordinated raid was planned with military precision. 12 armed men, 2 bishops, 3 undercover clerics. All briefed, all silent. March 20th, 1850. Before dawn, the seminary was surrounded. Father Walsh was found in the main chapel, reciting morning psalms. Rector Murphy was at his desk, writing what appeared to be a business letter. Dean O'Brien was in the stables, grooming his prized stallion. None of them resisted. Not physically. Instead, they tried one last manipulation. Walsh, speaking to the marshals, claimed religious persecution. "This is anti-Catholic hatred," he shouted. "You dare invade a house of God?" But when Bishop Montini stepped forward and presented Vatican-certified documents exposing their true identities, the fight left him. Father Edmund Walsh was actually Seamus McKenna, a Dublin criminal with a long record of violence, smuggling, and fraud. Thomas Murphy was revealed as Liam Doherty, an expert forger and financial manipulator. Patrick O'Brien? His real name was Fergus Lynch, a known murderer, enforcer, and the man suspected of personally executing at least 7 of the disappeared students. With the 3 criminals in chains, the investigation expanded. Under Montini's direct supervision, federal marshals and church officials scoured the seminary grounds. What they found confirmed every horror James had described, and more. Behind the east wing, they discovered a root cellar cleverly disguised with stacked firewood. Inside, crates filled with correspondence, receipts, and payment ledgers, maps of trafficking routes, even photographs, daguerreotypes of victims before sale. Near the northern orchard, beneath a false compost pit, they uncovered the first shallow grave. Then another. And another. 7 bodies in total. Most bore signs of blunt force trauma to the head. All were male, aged between 18 and 25. Each one had been stripped of identifying items except for one. A silver rosary, still clutched in a frozen hand. Michael Brennan. His grandmother's rosary had never left him. Even in death. The story exploded across Illinois. Newspapers labeled it the Seminary of Slaughter. Protestants saw it as proof of Catholic danger. Catholics wept with shame and fury. Parents of former students traveled from across the Midwest, some begging to search the fields themselves. James O'Malley became an unexpected hero, the boy who risked everything to expose evil in God's house. Montini offered him anything: education in Rome, a place in the Vatican, a fast track to the priesthood. James declined. He'd seen too much. He chose instead a career in law enforcement, joining the U.S. Marshals to track human trafficking rings across the nation. His work would go on to rescue over 300 people over 3 decades. But Sacred Heart never left him. Not the faces, not the secrets, not the sound of wagon wheels in the snow. By late spring of 1850, The Sacred Heart scandal had erupted beyond the boundaries of Illinois. What began as whispered suspicions inside the seminary had now ignited into one of the most horrifying revelations in American religious history. Newspapers from Chicago to New York carried front-page headlines. Seminary of Sin. 17 young men vanish under cloak of clergy. Priests unmasked as criminals. In $100,000 human trafficking ring. Catholic horror, murder, slavery, and deception in God's house. Across the nation, outrage boiled over. For Protestants, it confirmed every suspicion they'd harbored about Catholicism. Secrecy, corruption, foreign infiltration. For Catholics, it was a betrayal so deep, so shameful, that entire communities fell into silence. And for the families of the victims, it was unbearable. Mothers wept in public hearings. Fathers demanded answers. Some, like Michael Brennan's parents, traveled to Springfield just to witness the trials, holding rosaries they believed would never again bring them peace. The three criminal, Seamus McKenna, alias Father Walsh, Liam Doherty, alias Rector Murphy, and Fergus Lynch, alias Dean O'Brien, were held in a fortified jail outside Springfield under round-the-clock guard. There were credible threats of mob violence, but Bishop Montini insisted that justice must be seen, not just done. The trial began in August 1850. It was the first major human trafficking case ever prosecuted in the United States, and it quickly became a national obsession. Courtrooms overflowed with reporters, priests, skeptics, and bereaved families. Every session was transcribed, every argument debated in the press. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney Jonathan Fielding, presented overwhelming evidence. Forged ordination papers, coded letters detailing sales, ledgers matching victims to, payment records, and eyewitness testimony. Most damning of all? A live witness, Joseph Kennedy, the once silent seminarian who had heard the wagon wheels, who had seen the flickering lanterns, who had stood beside James O'Malley in documenting the disappearances. He pointed to each of the accused and declared, "I saw them take my friend. I saw them dispose of the body. And I lived in silence. Until now." The defense tried everything: claims of religious persecution, fabricated stories of secret church missions, even forged testimonials from buyers who never appeared in court. But the mountain of evidence was too high, too damning. Even the jury, half Protestant and half Catholic, took only 4 hours to deliberate. Verdict: guilty on all counts. Charges included multiple counts of murder, human trafficking across state lines, fraudulent impersonation of clergy, conspiracy to commit systemic abuse. Sentence: death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for August 15, 1851, exactly 1 year after the arrests. The hanging drew over 5,000 spectators. Entire families came by wagon from neighboring states. Vendors sold hot cider and printed pamphlets titled Confessions of the False Priests. Anti-Catholic protesters waved signs that read, "Rome's mask is off." McKenna, ever manipulative, shouted biblical verses until the final moment. Doherty remained silent. But Fergus Lynch, his eyes cold and unblinking, smiled as the noose was tightened. No one wept. As the trapdoors opened and the 3 men fell. A silence swept through the quay. Crowd: not satisfaction, not joy, but a heavy, haunted quiet, as if something too large for words had finally dropped into the earth with them. But death was only the beginning. The investigation, under Bishop Montini's command, expanded to 4 other dioceses. Letters from Sacred Heart matched records in Wisconsin, Indiana, and Minnesota. At least 200 young men were suspected victims of this larger trafficking ring. Some had been located and rescued. Others were never heard from again. The buyers, many of them wealthy industrialists, were quietly blacklisted. A few faced charges. Most disappeared into history, protected by money and distance. The Catholic Church, shaken to its foundations, went into crisis mode. Montini returned to Rome with detailed reports. Pope Pius IX, horrified, initiated sweeping reforms. All missionary priests now required multi-layer verification. A new central registry of clergy was established in the Vatican. Unannounced visitations to seminaries became standard policy. The Church issued a rare public apology, calling Sacred Heart a grave wound upon the body of Christ, and the seminary? It was permanently closed. Its ornate Gothic halls were sealed, its sacred relics removed, and months later, the entire structure was demolished brick by brick. The land was sold to local farmers. Though few dared build on it, locals whispered of shadows, voices, and strange sounds at night. The prairie, they said, had absorbed too much pain to ever rest. James O'Malley? He kept no glory for himself. He returned to Detroit and joined the U.S. Marshals, becoming one of the nation's first dedicated investigators of human trafficking. Over 3 decades, he rescued hundreds, arrested dozens, and trained younger officers in the sign sacred. Hart had taught him to see. He never married. He never returned to seminary life. But every year, on August 15th, he lit a candle. 17 candles. To be exact, one for each of the boys who never got out. Years passed, but the shadows of Sacred Heart never truly faded. Though the seminary had been torn down and its grounds repurposed as farmland, the land itself seemed restless. The new owners, despite generous compensation from the diocese, refused to live on it. Crops planted near the chapel foundation withered inexplicably. Horses refused to cross the northern pasture. And more than once, late-night travelers claimed to hear hymns carried on the wind-soom in voices far too young for the dead. But it wasn't just local folklore. Across the nation, Sacred Heart had planted something else doubt. A permanent scar on the face of American Catholicism. Priests, once revered without question, were now watched more closely. Parents thought twice before sending sons to distant seminaries. Bishops were asked, for the first time, to prove the credentials of their clergy. And though many church leaders resented this suspicion, few could deny Sacred Heart had been the cost of blind faith. In Rome, the fallout shook the Vatican for over a decade. Bishop Montini, once a quiet scholar, became one of the most influential reformers in church history. He was elevated to cardinal, then tasked with rooting out corruption in seminaries across 3 continents. His reports led to the closure of 15 institutions and the excommunication of over 60 clergy involved in similar abuses. But Montini never forgot Sacred Heart. He kept one artifact on his desk until the day he died, a small tarnished crucifix, found buried in the orchard beside Michael Brennan's body. It served as both a warning and a vow. Never again. Meanwhile, in America, the church fought to rebuild trust. New seminaries were constructed under strict guidelines. Families were invited to visit, tour, and inspect. Lay committees were formed to oversee priest conduct. Psychological screening, previously unheard of, became standard practice. But no amount of policy could erase the memory dot. And then came the letters dot in 1853. 3 years after the trial, a trunk was discovered in a barn attic on the outskirts of Milwaukee. It had belonged to a former trader who had died of illness. Inside were dozens of unsent letters pleas from boys who had been trafficked after disappearing from Sacred Heart. Somehow, they had survived. One letter read, "I am called John now. They don't use my name. I work in the mill. They say if I speak again, my hands will be broken. But I remember Mass. I remember the bells. I remember Thomas crying. If anyone finds this, please send word to my mother. Her name is Bridget. She lives on Water Street." Only 4 boys were identified from the letters. Two were found alive, working in brutal factory conditions. One had died of pneumonia weeks before the trunk's discovery. And one had taken his own life in 1851. Their stories reignited public rage. The church responded by forming its first ever clerical justice commission, a panel of clergy and civilians empowered to audit all seminaries and dioceses in the U.S. The Sacred Heart case became a case study in every seminary ethics class from that point onward. James O'Malley never forgot them. Even after he retired from law enforcement in 1884, he continued writing articles, testifying before church panels, and educating young priests on vigilance. He kept the students' names engraved on a copper plaque that hung over his fireplace. In a letter to his friend Joseph Kennedy, dated just before his death, James wrote, "People still ask me if Sacred Heart could happen again. I tell them it never stopped. It just changes names. Evil doesn't die when we kill the man. It dies when we expose the system, and sometimes not even then." He passed away in 1885, buried in a modest grave with a wooden marker that read only, "James O'Malley, Truth Above All." That same year, a traveling missionary stumbled across ruins deep in the Illinois prairie stone foundations, nearly swallowed by earth and vines. It was Sacred Heart's east wing, the only part of the seminary that hadn't been raised properly. Beneath the rubble, they found two things: a rusted candelabra and a wall etching, crudely carved into the stone. God sees what men bury. By 1886, 36 years after the fall of Sacred Heart, the world had changed. Steam trains carved through the Midwest. Telegraph lines buzzed with distant voices. Towns had risen from muddy roads into bustling cities. But in one forgotten corner of Illinois, near an overgrown trail locals no longer used, the silence still held something sacred. And sinister. Few dared speak of Sacred Heart Seminary anymore. The scandal had been absorbed into textbooks and whispered over by scholars. But for those who had lived through it, for the families, the survivors, and the men who brought it down, the memory was still raw. Joseph Kennedy, now a retired schoolteacher in Iowa, received an unmarked envelope in the spring of that year. Inside was a single page, yellowed at the edges, written in an elegant hand. "You saw more than you were ever meant to. But we never stopped watching. There are still doors you've never opened, still graves no one has found. A friend in." The walls, it was unsigned. Postmarked from Springfield. Joseph, now in his 60s, had not thought about Sacred Heart in years. He lived quietly, unmarried, childless, teaching Latin and history to boys who reminded him of the friends he'd lost. That letter changed everything. He reached out to the only man he trusted to understand, Daniel Brannock, a historian and archivist who had dedicated his career to uncovering lost church records. Brannock, intrigued by the letter, agreed to accompany Joseph back to the grounds of Sacred Heart, what was now a patchy, half-tilled field leased by a disinterested farmer. They arrived on June 21, 1886. The land looked ordinary. No monument, no markers, no memory. Even the trees had grown back, wild and gnarled. But Joseph remembered the walkways, the chapel's position, the exact slope where the dormitories once stood. And then he found it, a sunken indentation in the earth, perfectly square, as though something large had collapsed and never been filled. Brannock and Joseph dug for hours, using hands and shovels. They hit stone by sunset. It was a sealed hatch. They pried it open. Below, a narrow spiral stairwell descended into darkness long sealed, untouched by time. What they found beneath the earth rewrote the story one final time. This wasn't just a crypt. It was a second archive. Inside were more ledgers. Yes, but also personal effects. Rosaries, handwritten journals, wooden nameplates from bunks, letters that had never been sent. Even sketches, drawings by the boys of each other, of home, of dreams they would never live to see. In one box, carefully wrapped in cloth. Inside it, the original forged documents of the three impostors. But there was more. A fourth name. A priest no one had ever investigated. Brother James Keller. His signature appeared on nearly every major decision the seminary had made between 1847 and 1850. And yet, no one remembered him. He had not been arrested, not been named at trial, not mentioned by survivors. Keller had vanished. Just before the raid, Brannock took the findings to the diocese. Shock swept through the church again decades later. Who was Keller? Records showed a James Keller ordained in Ireland. But 10 years after Sacred Heart had already opened, photos didn't match. His name appeared on property deeds, shipment invoices, and even in correspondences with buyers. He hadn't just been part of the scheme. He may have been the mastermind, but where was he now? In an 1892 census record, Brannock found a man named John M. Keller living in New York under a new identity, listed as a retired cleric. He was 78, quiet, wealthy, with no known parish work. When Brannock arrived at his townhouse, the butler answered coldly, "There is no priest here." Brannock slipped his card into the man's hand anyway. That night, the townhouse caught fire. Nothing survived. Keller was never seen again. And yet, something changed in Joseph after that final discovery. He stopped teaching. He started writing. His memoir, The Quiet Ones. What the Church Forgot to Bury was published in 1895. It was controversial, raw, and filled with detail the Church begged him to soften. He refused. It sold 10,000 copies in its first year. It opened a new era of public questioning, of reform, of accountability, but most importantly, it gave the voiceless their echo. For the first time, the boys of Sacred Heart were no longer just lost. They were remembered. They say some places never forget, even after a century, long after walls collapse and names fade from headstones, the ground remembers. The wind that moves through empty fields still carries the weight of the ones who never left. By the year 1900, Sacred Heart was gone in every visible way. No brick remained, no path, no bell tower casting long shadows at dusk. The last local who had known someone at the seminary had died that spring, leaving behind only a single memory. It was always too quiet there, even when full, but one. Man wasn't done. Daniel Brannock, now an old archivist with failing eyesight and trembling hands, returned to the site with a final purpose: to memorialize the 17 boys. Over 2 decades had passed since he and Joseph Kennedy uncovered the hidden archive. Since the world learned of James Keller's mysterious disappearance. Since the Vatican buried the case under layers of silence. But Brannock hadn't forgotten. He couldn't. He arrived with a cart carrying only 2 things: a wooden post and a bronze plaque. It read, "In memory of those taken. Their names may fade from books, but not from the land where they were lost. Sacred Heart Seminary, 1847 to 1850. 17 lights extinguished. May their silence speak forever." He hammered it into the earth alone, no crowd, no reporters. Just the whisper of tall grass and the quiet crack of memory folding in on itself. Then he stood in stillness, hat in hand, until the wind stopped. Somewhere, deep in church archives, still sealed from public eyes, lies a thick leather bound dossier marked with a red insignia: Scum Item, Sacerdotal Fraud, Midwest File Number 4. Code name, HERD. Inside are copies of every letter, every confession, every name associated with the Sacred Heart case. And in the back, handwritten by an anonymous Vatican scribe: "Though justice was delivered by man, the reckoning of heaven remains. Let no institution be so proud as to think itself above the cost of blood. The Church must not forget, not because it is convenient, but because forgetting is what allowed it. But history is a strange thing. Some stories stay alive in books and lectures, others ... In walls, in trees, in places we pretend don't exist. By 1920, children from Millfield would dare each other to walk the former seminary grounds at night. They'd joke about ghosts, invent stories of black-robed priests and lanterns that floated, without fire, but once in a while, just often enough, to keep the tales alive, someone heard singing. Faint, harmonized, male voices. No lyrics, just a soft, mournful tune, and always from beneath the earth. In 1946, a construction crew breaking ground for a new farmhouse found a sealed metal box, buried 6 feet deep near the old orchard line. Inside were personal items: a wooden rosary, a Bible with Latin notes in the margins, a pair of cracked spectacles, and a simple slip of paper. On it, "If this box is ever found, know that I was one of the lucky ones. My name is Joseph Kennedy. I survived because I stayed silent. And then I spoke. May you do the same." The box now rests in the Illinois State Historical Museum. Underneath it reads, "The Sacred Heart Witness Chest, the case that changed." American Seminary Law. Today, Sacred Heart is not a tourist site. There's no statue, no gift shop. Just a low hill, half swallowed by prairie grass, where the wind sometimes sings. But if you listen long enough, really listen, you might hear them. Not screams. Not suffering, but something softer. Forgiveness. Maybe. Or the echo of 17 voices still holding morning prayer.